Hi everyone, it's Alice, and today we're going to talk about the books I read in January. The new reading year started off really well for me. I have quite a lot of books to talk about today. I have 7, which is great. I do feel like now I'm sort of getting back to my usual 1 book a week pace, but it was fun to get like a really good start to the new year, and we should probably just jump into it because this is gonna take a while. I started off the year by reading Magpie Murders by Anthony Horowitz, and this is a mystery novel, and it's about this editor who gets the latest script from her publishing house's most famous author, and that author has like published several novels with this publishing house, and she has worked on all of them. And she sits down with this thinking that it's gonna be like every other time. She starts reading it, and it becomes clear pretty early on that there's more to the story than just the story. This is a book that I've had for a while, and I've wanted to read it since I got it, obviously, but I've been a little bit intimidated by the size, I think, which is why I've been putting it off. But I thought maybe starting the new year with a book that I've had for a long time and really thought I was going to like was like the right move. And it definitely was. A lot of you have actually told me that I'm really going to like this book, so you'll be happy to know that you were right. I really enjoyed it. It has like that book within a book type of thing, so we actually read the story of the editor, but we also read the manuscript that she gets, and that's like half the book. And when I was getting into this, I was a little bit unsure how that was going to work and if it was going to work for me, but I really enjoyed it. And it basically kind of means that we don't just have one mystery to solve, we have 2. We get to see 2 different settings in here. The manuscript is set in like a small village in 1950s England, which I really enjoyed, and then the present day perspective is set in contemporary London, and I really liked both, but I think I especially enjoyed like the vibe of the manuscript and like the feeling of that, because it has that kind of like golden age of mystery vibe to it, which I really like. I also really liked how the characters were done, and without giving too much away, there is like some overlap between the stories when it comes to the characters that I thought was really cool. And I was just really invested in this, and I was a little bit like concerned when we did the switch from the manuscript to the contemporary part of the story. I was like, am I gonna enjoy this as much? But I was really invested, and this has like a compulsive feeling to it that just made me want to keep going. My only slight complaint is that I do think this is just a tad too long, and I think when we got to the present day perspective, that's when things started to slow down a little bit. And the thing is, it makes sense in the story why things are taking so long. Like, it makes perfect sense, but it just felt like it dragged a little bit. But I really did enjoy this a lot. Like, this is a solid 4 out of 5 star read for me. It has like almost a cozy vibe to it in a way without being like a full-on cozy mystery. I think maybe in part because the manuscript is set in like the 1950s, and that has like a cozy mystery vibe to it. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I felt very lost in this book. Like, it was a lot of fun, and it was also quite clever, which I appreciate. The second book that I read and finished was Nettle and Bone by Kingfisher. This is a fantasy novel, and it's about this princess turned nun, kind of, that basically decides to save her sister from this awful prince that she's married to. And in order to do that, she basically has to go on an adventure, and with her she has this like witch who has power over the dead, a fairy godmother of sorts, and a knight slash criminal, and most importantly, a chicken possessed by a demon. All of those people get together and they go on an adventure to try and save the main character's sister. Again, this was so much fun. Like, I adored this, and I really shouldn't be surprised because I love a good like fantasy fairy tale-esque adventure type thing, and this is quite whimsical, which I really like. And I think that I went into this thinking it was something else. Like, I've heard this referred to as horror, and I feel like that's not really what it is. Like, now that I've read this, I would classify this as like straight up fantasy adventure with like fairy tale vibes. It did kind of take me a minute to really grasp what kind of story this was when I started reading it, because I really did go into it thinking that it was going to be a lot darker and it was going to have more horror to it. But you do kind of sense when you're a few chapters in that that's not what it is, and it has a more like whimsical vibe. The characters are kind of like quirky. I do feel like I should have maybe realized, because when I went into this, I didn't know that there was gonna be a demon-possessed chicken in it, which tells you a little bit about the tone, but I don't know. I just expected something else, and I was pleasantly surprised that this is what it is. Anyways, I ended up really, really enjoying this. Like, it was so much fun, but it also wasn't devoid of depth. Like, there's a lot of fun, interesting stuff going on, but there are also some tense moments and some like interesting discussion. I really like the characters in here as well, maybe especially the side characters, because it's just such an interesting bunch of people, and it's interesting to see the main character gather these people up, and they really go on like a proper adventure quest. Like, they have a goal and they go on this journey, and following them on this journey was really fun, and seeing them try to figure everything out, and there's like a proper adventure build up, and I really enjoyed that. But I also really enjoyed the end and how everything came together. The main character is also an interesting one, and she's an interesting character to read about, because when she goes on this adventure, she is actually in her 30s, and it's interesting because she feels really, really young, and she's quite naive in a lot of ways, and that does make sense in the context of her life. But I did kind of keep forgetting that she wasn't that young, and like, she just feels very, very inexperienced and just very young, and I thought that was interesting. I also really like the world that we get to see in here. In some ways, I kind of wish we had seen more of it, but I also completely like support the choice to just keep pressing on with the story and not spending time on things that don't really matter to this particular like quest. And I feel like it kept the pace up and it made it more engaging, which I really like, and I did like the parts of the world that we did get to see. This feels really creative to me, and I love the humor in it. Like, it has a humorous tone to it that I just adore, and like, I chuckled several times reading this, and it was just so much fun. I also think that this has, in some ways, like a cozy vibe to it, in the way that it's kind of like a darker kind of cozy book, and I completely agree with people who say that this feels like a fairy tale in a lot of ways, because it does. It actually, now that I'm talking about it, it reminds me a little bit, like when it comes to that cozy but darker vibe, it reminds me a little bit of Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. Like, that's also a cozy book with a darker vibe, and although these books aren't really the same, it has some of the same vibe to it, I feel. And I also think that Emily Wilde, like, it has some humor to it as well, and this also has some humor, and that there are some similarities between that kind of humor. So I think if you like that book, you might like this, because at least for me, I see some similarities. When I finished this, I thought I would give it 4 stars, but on reflection, I think I'm gonna give it 5, actually, because there's nothing missing in this really for me. Like, it was a lot of fun, it was filled with adventure, it had a cool fantasy world, there's a lot of interesting characters that I loved and I'm gonna keep thinking about, and this is actually the same thing that happened with Emily Wilde. Like, that book, I gave that 4 stars in the beginning, and then on reflection I gave it a 5-star, because it's like perfect for me. It's whimsical and fun and magical. I think for me in this, the thing that really does it for me and like makes it a 5-star book is the chicken. Like, the chicken really did it for me in here. Then I read The Cloisters by Katy Hayes, and this is a contemporary mystery-ish novel, and it's about this woman who goes to New York, desperate to get away from her life back home, and she goes there because she's supposed to have this internship at the Met. But when she gets there, she's actually instead assigned to a place called the Cloisters, which is like a Gothic museum and gardens. And she goes to work there, and when she gets there, she gets to know some of the other people who work there, who are really into like divination and tarot cards and things like that. And it becomes apparent pretty early on that these people are up to something, and they're being very secretive about it. So this is an interesting one because when I was reading this book, I was totally in it. Like, I was so invested and I couldn't stop reading it. But then when I finished it, on reflection, I do see some things that I maybe didn't like as much, and there are some things where I'm like, But to be honest, I will say, like, I didn't really notice it when I was reading this. First though, I think one of the reasons that I felt so sucked into this in a way is because of the atmosphere. The place that this woman goes to, like the museum and the gardens, like, it has such an amazing vibe to it, and I felt like I could really picture it. It is a real place, and I'm probably not picturing it in the way that it actually is, but like the way I conjured it up in my head, it was like such an atmospheric vibe. This is also set in the middle of summer, and it's like really hot, and it has this like hazy, eerie feeling to it that I just absolutely loved, and I just couldn't stop reading because of that. I also really liked reading about our characters, like I was really invested in them, but this is one of those parts where in hindsight I see that it maybe wasn't as good as I was sort of making it, because the characters are quite stereotypical, which is maybe why it was so easy to get invested in them. But I almost feel like I filled in some of the blanks while I was reading this, and there wasn't actually that much like character development, but I was like, I guess, filling in the gaps. And I think that became apparent when I got to the end and the main character made some choices where I was like, what? I did also really like that at the center of the story we have a female friendship, which is a little bit messed up and there's some tensions in the friendship, but it was interesting to have and interesting to explore, and I really liked seeing our main character trying to navigate it. There are also several mysteries in here, like there's more going on than just the tarot card and divination stuff, like there's a lot more, and I really liked exploring all of it, and I feel like this book took a lot of turns that I wasn't really expecting, and that made it exciting. I think some of it is a little bit predictable, like especially some of the stuff that happens in the middle of the book, but other than that, this took a lot of turns that I didn't see coming at all. I also really like the occult elements that we have in here and some of the history bits, which I really enjoyed. Even if it's not like real, I really enjoy having those kinds of elements in books, and this has that, and it really worked for me. I do think though, now that I've finished it and it's been a little while, I wonder if this is more of a forgettable novel than I thought it was going to be when I finished it. The thing that is really sticking with me is like the vibe of it and the feeling of it. Because of that, I'm gonna give this a 3 out of 5 stars, which means that I read and enjoyed it, but like the more I think about it, the more things I'm sort of noticing in hindsight, if that makes sense. But again, like I said, when I was reading this, I was totally sucked into it. Didn't really notice that much at all. Like, I was really invested, and I had a really good time reading this. I feel like it's the kind of book that's definitely worth the read, but I will mention it is on the slower side, and for me, this is the kind of book that I would only recommend to particular people. It's not a book that I would easily recommend to like everyone. The main like great thing about this book really is the atmosphere and the gothic setting, and also this like summery oppressive heat to it, and I think that's like a really big part of why I enjoyed this book. I also think if you go into this thinking it's going to be a lot about occult stuff and tarot cards, That is a part of the story, but it's not the main part of the story, and there's a lot of other stuff going on. So I think for this, if you're gonna like it, it has like a mystery vibe to it, but it really is a story of friendship and sort of trying to navigate a new life. And I would say that more than being about the occult, which like I feel like the back really delves into that, it's more a story of mystery, like a mystery vibe, and just ambition in a lot of ways. Then I read The Last Devil to Die by Richard Osman, which is a mystery novel, and as I'm sure a lot of you know, this is the 4th book in the Thursday Murder Club series, where we follow a group of pensioners who are all part of this murder club, and they love getting involved in all kinds of investigations. In this book, there is this antique seller who dies. In the beginning of the book, he's murdered, and because the Thursday Murder Club know him, they get involved in the investigation. Although I feel like even if they didn't know him, they would get involved either way, because they are very nosy, and they like getting involved in mysteries and getting involved in other people's business. So, to no surprise to anyone, I really enjoyed this book, and I feel like my review of it is going to be very similar as my review of the 2nd and 3rd book, which is that this was enjoyable, entertaining, and clever. I'm not going to go on about this too much, but as always, I really enjoyed reconnecting with these characters and seeing what they get up to. I enjoyed the mystery, the humor, which is a big part of these books, and it was just very enjoyable. I do feel like at this point, I know what I'm getting when I'm picking these books up, so I always pick them up when I'm in the mood for them, which definitely makes the reading experience better, but yeah, these are always just a lot of fun and very, very entertaining and enjoyable. I guess I will mention one thing though that sets this a little bit apart from the other 3 books. We have an arc in here that involves one of the main characters, which was surprisingly sad. And it took me a little bit, like, it took me by surprise because I wasn't really expecting it, which maybe I should have, because we have sort of been building up to it in the other books. But like, that took a turn and added a layer to this that I wasn't really expecting, but that I really, really like. Overall though, a solid 4 out of 5 stars, super enjoyable. It also does say in the afterword that this might not be the last book in the series. I thought it was going to be the last one, but apparently it might not be. He wrote that he might write more stories in this series, but for now he's going to focus on another series, which is going to be like a father-daughter detective duo, which I think sounds like a lot of fun. Like, I would love to read that, especially like with this writing style and this kind of humor. I think that could be a lot of fun. But it means that we might get more of these kinds of books in the future, which I do kind of hope that we get, because I would like to read more about these characters. But I also feel like if this is where it ends, this is a good place to end it. After that, I picked up another quite chunky book. Look at me making my way through some of my chunkier books. I'm very happy with that. This is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, and this is like fantasy, contemporary fiction / historical fiction, romance, I guess. And we follow this woman who in France in the early 1700s, she makes a deal with the devil to live forever and basically escape something that's happening in her life. And this is granted to her, but of course there's a drawback, and the drawback is that she will be forgotten by everyone that she meets. And this is obviously not great, but then we meet her, like, we follow her life overall, but we also meet her in contemporary times when she finally runs into someone who actually remembers her. So I have a lot of thoughts about this book. I know that this is a very well-loved book. Like, a lot of people really enjoy this, and I think that made me go into this with quite high expectations, and it did sound really, really good. And then also, I have read several other books by this author and really, really liked them. So I think I went into this with quite a lot of thoughts, and I gotta be honest with you, I was very underwhelmed by this. There are a lot of positives about this though, so let's maybe start with that. I do think that the concept of the story is a really good idea, and from the beginning I was intrigued by this. Like, it did pull me in from the very first page, so there was something in here that worked for me. I think the writing is beautiful. Like, there are several parts in this where I stopped and I reread something because it was just beautifully written. And there are several historical settings that we get to see in here that I really like. Now, although I was intrigued by this in the beginning, I'm not gonna lie, it didn't take me that long until this started losing me a little bit. But then, because I really thought that I was gonna love this, I was like, okay, let's just go with it. Like, it's a longer book, it's gonna be a little bit slower, let's just get on with it and make our way through it. But unfortunately, the further I got into this, the more repetitive I felt it got. And although the writing is beautiful, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, and I feel like it just started to really drag. I just think it's too long, by a lot. And I don't know if I'm insane, but I feel like you could have taken out like 300 pages of this book and it wouldn't have mattered at all. And the thing is, like, I don't need a book to have a lot happening in it plot-wise, but I think the thing with this is that if I'm gonna read and enjoy this kind of book, I need a main character that I can connect to. And when I started reading this, I really thought our main character was gonna be like that because it's just such an interesting premise. But then we follow her, and she lives for 300 years, and she is just the same throughout all of it. Like, she just felt the same to me. And even when she meets this person who finally remembers her, she just feels exactly the same. And she's had all of this life, and she just felt exactly the same to me throughout all of it. We do have other characters in here as well, but none of them really felt that interesting to me, unfortunately. Maybe I'm just missing something here. Like, maybe there's something here that I don't understand, but I think I expected this to dig deeper into things. Maybe I was expecting it to get like darker or crazier, but I just felt like I was reading this and I kept waiting for something to happen. And I just kind of feel like I got the same thing over and over and over and over. And to be honest, I just got really bored with it. There is stuff that happens in this, and there's stuff happening at the end. But when I got to that, I was so over it that I just couldn't really get invested in it. I did like the ending though, which I read some reviews after finishing this, and I know that some people really didn't like the ending, but for some reason it kind of worked for me that it was a little bit open. I thought it was an interesting choice in, like, at the end of a very long dredge through this book. I kind of liked it. I don't really know what to rate this though, because, like, I really stand by the fact that the writing is beautiful. Like, there are a lot of beautiful sentences in here. I just think there's too much of it, and that makes it drag and it makes it really long. And I just think I would have liked this a lot more if it was just a little bit tighter in a way. Like, it's too long, there's too much of it, like, it's very repetitive. And I don't know. I have had comments saying that people agree with me. Like, I've had people before I read this say, like, you might not like this because of this, and this, and I agree with a lot of that. But I also know a lot of people love this book. So maybe don't take my word for it. I don't really know. For me, this is somewhere between like 2 and 3 stars. I'm maybe leaning more towards 2. Actually, but I will say that's probably because I really did go into this with quite high expectations, and that probably like made an impact on how I feel about it. But yeah, this was just not it for me. I do really like this author still though. She can really write, like a lot of other books that I've read by her, I really like, but this for me it just didn't work. Second to last, I read Near the Bone by Christina Henry, which is a horror thrillery type book, and it's about this woman who we meet. She is quite young and she lives in the mountains with her husband, and it says that she doesn't remember anything from the time before she came to live with this man, and she basically spends all of her days trying to not make him angry, because she says that, like, if he gets angry, that has a lot of consequences for her. And that's a whole thing, but then the plot kind of takes off when they realize that up in these mountains, they're usually alone, but there's something there, and they're not alone after all, and there's more than one thing sort of lurking in the dark. To be honest, I don't really know if I have that much to say about this book. I went into this with not a lot of expectations. I was just sort of expecting it to be atmospheric and have like a wintry setting, and it does have that, but other than that, this didn't really do a lot for me. This is a story of monsters in a lot of ways, both human and not human, and there are some interesting aspects to this, but I don't know, this really just didn't do much for me. And you would think that it would be really intriguing because it has an intriguing setup, but when I was reading this, I just wasn't invested. I also felt like it was quite predictable, and I just saw a lot of things coming. There are some things in the story that don't really make sense to me. I don't know if that's just me, but I don't know. I think the main thing that I was intrigued by with this is that there's like a creature stalking in the woods, and that is really cool, and that's the part that like made me finish this book, because I thought we would explore it a little bit more and we got to actually see it, but then we don't, which was a little bit disappointing because that was the only thing I was really invested in. It was a quick read though, I'll give it that. Like, I read this very quickly, but yeah, this just wasn't really for me. And I do think that the main issue with this is that I don't like these kinds of horror books, and if I had known that this is what it was, I wouldn't have bought it, because this just isn't my kind of horror. And I also will say I don't read a lot of horror, so maybe like I'm not the person to go to for the horror genre, but this for me just didn't really do anything, and it feels like a very forgettable book. The one thing I was interested in never really came to fruition, so, you know, I don't know. It was just kind of okay, and for me this is a 2 out of 5 star read. It's not necessarily the book's fault though, it's just I don't really like these kinds of books. I will mention though, if any of you are thinking of picking this up, it is very violent and it features several different types of violence, so just be aware of that. I never really get triggered by anything basically, like I just don't, but if you're concerned, maybe look up the trigger warnings first, because there's a lot of violence in this, and it's a lot. Lastly, I read a nonfiction book. It was The Way Through the Woods by Litt Woon, and this is a memoir, and it delves into the author's experience of suddenly losing her husband, and it explores her grief, but also her like taking up the hobby of mushroom gathering in like the wake of her husband's death. And it's a lot about that, but also just a lot about mushrooms in general, particularly in Norway, which is where she lives. And it's a lot about just grief and mushrooms. First of all, look at me reading a nonfiction book after not having read one for almost a year. One of my reading goals for this year is to read more nonfiction, so I'm happy that I'm getting into it already, and I feel like this was a good place to start. I really enjoyed this book. It was very interesting. There is a lot of information in this book, so it did take me quite a long time to read, but it's just because there was just a lot of information and I wanted to take my time with it. I love the kind of memoir where it combines the author's like life experience with something like a particular theme, like their work or their hobby, or like something else, especially if it's nature based, which is what this does, because it explores the author's experience of losing her husband and also mushrooms. And it was very interesting, and the way that it explored mushrooms was like a little bit different than I thought it was going to be. I didn't really expect this to be so factual, and we get to learn about all kinds of different mushrooms in here, and not just the act of like gathering mushrooms, which is maybe what I thought it was going to be. But we learned a lot about mushrooms and fungi in general in here, which I thought was really interesting, and I maybe surprisingly really enjoyed it. It also talks a lot about sort of the culture of mushroom gathering, especially in Norway, but also how it differs in different countries and how attitudes towards mushrooms is like different in different places, which I didn't know before I read this book. So there's a lot about mushrooms and a lot of facts about them, and then in between the author shares her experience of grief and making her way through that. And that is a thing that I really like reading about, because I think grief can be such an individual experience and it can be really different for different people. And because of that, I always think it's really interesting to read about. I also really like how this is written. Like, there are a lot of beautiful phrases in here, but reading it, I will say, I don't know if I mentioned this. I think I mentioned it in the book haul where I got this book, but this book is actually originally written in Norwegian. And having read this book, and while I was reading it, I did kind of wish that I was reading it in Norwegian, because I am Norwegian, and I think it would have been even better to get to read it in the original language. And I also think a lot of the mushroom facts and the names for mushrooms would have made more sense to me, because obviously things are named something else in English and I usually only know the Norwegian names for particular things. And so I think it would have just spared me kind of a lot of time looking things up and looking up the translation of like names and stuff. And, you know, I should have just read it in Norwegian, to be honest, but it was really good in English as well. The only thing that I will say about this that I think wasn't, I mean, it maybe wasn't done as well. We have these two parallel things going on, right? Like, we have the author dealing with her grief and also her discovering mushrooms and becoming a mushroom gatherer. Like, those are two parallel stories. But I don't know if I feel like they blend that well in here. Like, when I was reading this, it felt very much like two separate things. And although they overlap a little bit, they weren't as intertwined as I maybe thought they were going to be. Like, I thought it would be more like seamless, and it does, for the most part, feel like sort of two separate things, and you kind of have to like make the connection yourself in a way. I don't know if that's an actual like choice. It is mentioned in the afterword, like some of the writing process for this and how that was a little bit separate, but I think it could have maybe been blended just a little bit better. Other than that though, I really enjoyed this. It has a quietness to it that I really like, and it just taught me a lot. Like, I feel like I learned a lot, and it also made me want to like read more about mushrooms. So if anyone has any mushroom book tips, let me know. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. Definitely enjoyed it. I will say though, I do think going into this book with the right expectations is kind of important, because I read some reviews after I finished this, and I saw in a lot of the reviews that people had expected the mushroom bit to be different. The stuff about mushrooms in here is about gathering mushrooms and sort of the culture around that, and it's a lot about edible mushrooms, and it's not really about fungi in any other way, or like mushrooms and fungi and how it relates to death, which I hadn't even thought of when I went into this book. Like, I just thought it was about eating mushrooms and gathering mushrooms, so I went into it with the right expectations. But I can see that you would maybe assume that there would be some sort of overlap there, and it is very briefly mentioned, but like, that's not what the mushroom part in here is about. It's about the culture of gathering mushrooms and what it did for her, and it's not about like that relating to death in any way. That was the last book though. As you can see, I had a pretty good reading month. I made my way through quite a lot of books. Not all of them were that great, but I'm happy to have read a lot of these, and sometimes it's nice to read books that you don't necessarily like as much, just so you can like get them out of your life, if that makes sense. Like, you can just let them go. But I also read some really good ones, and I had a 5-star read, which is rare for me, as you may know. I feel like this year I'm gonna try to be a little bit more generous with my 5-star ratings, because like last year I only had 3, I think. 4 because I did a little edit on one of them, but yeah, I'm gonna try to be a little bit more generous with that because I feel like some of the books I give 4 stars to, I really could give 5 stars to because it doesn't need to be perfect to get like a 5-star rating. Anyways, I'm just rambling. I would love to know what you all have read for the first month of the year, and if you had any 5-star reads, or just tell me about the books you read. I would love to hear about it. As always, thank you for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!